Clara Doyle was 29 years old, widowed 11 months, and down to the last coin she would ever call her own. It was Silas Pruitt, her late husband's father, and the man who owned nearly every timber lease and mine share in Solace Creek, Colorado Territory, who had put her out of the house that she'd shared with his son, telling the whole town she'd brought nothing but debt into the family and deserved nothing to leave with. What she carried out the door fit in one carpet bag, and what she had in her pocket after the wagon fare came to $11.40. So when the land office clerk mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a worthless stretch of rock called Raven's Ridge was sitting unclaimed under her late grandfather's name, needing only $9 in back taxes to pass to her, folks who heard about it called it the last foolish decision of a woman with nothing left to lose. They had no way of knowing that sealed somewhere in that mountain was a chamber that would not only save her, but the very town that had turned its back on her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Doyle. If you have ever been told that what's left of you isn't worth claiming, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Clara had not always been a woman without a name of her own. Before she was Clara Doyle, she was Clara Bishop, granddaughter of Thomas Bishop, a man the town of Solace Creek had once called an engineer and later, unkindly, called madman. Thomas Bishop had come west in the early days of the mining boom with a surveyor's transit and a set of drafting tools he treated with more tenderness than most men treated their children, and for a time he had been the most trusted man on the mountain, the one the mining companies paid to tell them where the rock was sound and where it would swallow a manhole. Clara had spent the summers of her girlhood at his cabin on the low slope before he moved higher up the ridge, and it was there, sitting on an overturned bucket while he bent over his ledgers by lamplight, that she had learned to read a stone the way other girls learned to read a hymnal. He taught her to recognize the seams that meant water was near, the color of tailings that meant a vein had pinched out, the particular ring a hammer made against granite that was sound versus granite that was hollow underneath and waiting to fall. He taught her, too, though she did not understand it then, that the worth of a thing was rarely written on its face. Anybody can love what shines, Clara girl, he used to say, tapping a plain gray rock against his palm before splitting it to show her the vein of quartz hidden at its heart. It takes a patient eye to love what hasn't shown you yet what it's made of. She had carried that lesson with her the way other women carried a locket, taking it out and turning it over whenever the world told her she was worth less than she knew herself to be. Her grandfather had not been a rich man, not in the way Solace Creek measured riches, but he had been respected until the year the cross-cut shaft collapsed and 4 men died in it, her own father among them. The official inquiry, paid for by the mine's owner, a hard and calculating man named Silas Pruitt, ruled the collapse an act of nature, unavoidable and no one's fault. Thomas Bishop, who had surveyed that very shaft 18 months before and flagged the support timbers as inadequate, tried to say otherwise, and for his trouble he was quietly and thoroughly ruined. His surveying contracts dried up. His name, once spoken with respect, became something men said with a small, embarrassed laugh, the way you'd speak of an old dog that barked at nothing. He retreated up the mountain to a plot so poor and so steep that no one thought to dispute his claim to it, and there he lived out his last 15 years alone, visited rarely, mourned less. Clara had been only 12 when her father died in that shaft, and by the time she was grown, married to a gentle, unambitious young man named Daniel Doyle who happened, by cruel coincidence, to be Silas Pruitt's own son from a second marriage. She had learned to keep her grandfather's name mostly to herself, the way you keep a wound covered so it doesn't catch on everything that brushes past it. Daniel had loved her plainly and without complication, and for 4 years she had allowed herself to believe that whatever bitterness lay between the Bishops and the Pruitts belonged to an older generation and would not follow her into her own quiet life. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong until after Daniel was gone. The fall, when it came the way falls do in mining country, suddenly on the surface and slowly for years underneath. Daniel worked as a foreman in his father's Solace Creek Mining Company, more out of duty than desire. In the spring of 1888, he was overseeing a new drift in the Comstock vein shaft when a timber gave way exactly where the old inspection reports, if anyone had bothered to read Thomas Bishop's original surveys, would have said it might. Daniel did not die instantly. He lingered 4 days, long enough for Clara to sit beside him and hear him whisper, in a voice gone thin with fever, that the shoring had looked wrong to him, and he'd said so and been told there wasn't money in the budget to redo it. He died holding her hand, and Clara buried that confession alongside him, telling no one, because grief had made her too tired to fight, and because she still, foolishly, hoped Silas Pruitt might show her some mercy as a widow of his own blood. Instead, within the month, Pruitt's lawyer arrived at her door with a ledger claiming Daniel had drawn wages against a debt Pruitt said the household owed the company's store, a debt Clara had never seen documented while her husband lived. The house, it turned out, sat on company land. She was given 11 days to vacate. Neighbors who had eaten at her table would not meet her eye on the street afterward, not because they believed the debt was real, but because crossing Silas Pruitt in Solace Creek meant losing your own lease, your own credit, your own roof, and grief, they had all learned, does not pay rent. Clara left with her carpet bag, her grandfather's old brass compass, which was the one thing of his she'd kept, and $11.40 that had been saved for a rainy day that had clearly, finally, arrived. It was Mr. Whitcomb at the land office, an elderly clerk with ink-stained fingers and more kindness than his position required, who mentioned Raven's Ridge to her almost by accident, flipping through unclaimed parcels while she asked if there was any work to be had filing papers. Says here a Thomas Bishop's claim on the High Ridge is going to lapse for unpaid taxes come the new year, he said, tapping the page. $9 would clear it and pass it to next of kin. Can't imagine why you'd want it, mind. Nothing up there but rock and one of the old man's shacks, and everyone knows that ridge is cursed on account of what happened at the crosscut, it being the same mountain and all. Clara had gone very still at her grandfather's name. $9 was nearly all she had, and everything reasonable in her said to save it for a room and a meal, but something older than reason, something that remembered a gray rock split open to show quartz underneath, made her push the coins across the counter instead. Whitcomb counted them twice, as if expecting her to change her mind, and when she didn't, he stamped the deed and slid it toward her with something like pity. "Foolish, if you don't mind my saying," he murmured. Clara only folded the paper into her bag beside the brass compass, and said she didn't mind at all, because foolishness, she had decided, was cheaper than pride, and she had run entirely out of the second one. She walked the 6 miles up to Raven's Ridge the next morning with what remained of her belongings on her back, and what she found at the top was, by every ordinary measure, exactly as worthless as everyone had promised. The slope was steep and gray, thin-soiled, scattered with wind-bent pines and outcrops of granite that offered no view but more granite. Her grandfather's old shack, the one Whitcomb had mentioned, had half collapsed under a winter's snow load, its door hanging by one hinge, its floor thick with pine needles and mouse droppings. Clara stood in the doorway a long while, feeling the particular grief of a place that remembers someone and cannot tell you so directly. It was while she was clearing debris from the shack's single room, looking for anything salvageable, that her hand brushed a floorboard that gave slightly beneath her palm where the others did not. Curious more than hopeful, she pried it loose with the edge of her grandfather's old trowel, and beneath it found not a hollow full of rot, but a narrow stone stair cut with obvious deliberate labor, descending into the mountain itself. Her heart beat strangely as she lit the shack's one surviving lantern and went down 12 steps, then 20, the stone growing smooth and cool and clearly worked by hand and chisel over what must have been years, until the stairway opened into a low, wide chamber carved directly into the bones of the ridge, a cabin room in truth, with a proper stone hearth, a workbench, and shelves-lined floor to ceiling with ledgers, rolled surveys, and carefully labeled rock samples, every one of them, bearing her grandfather's careful, slanting hand. It took Clara 3 full days, working by lantern light and eating little, to understand what she had found, and by the end of the first day, she understood only that her grandfather had not spent his last 15 years in bitter idleness as the town believed, but in patient, obsessive documentation. The earliest ledgers, dated back to the year of the cross-cut collapse, contained his original survey notes on the shaft, page after page of careful measurements, and a final conclusion, underlined twice that the support timbers specified by the company were insufficient for the rock pressure he had recorded, a warning dated a full year before the collapse that killed her father and 3 other men. Attached to those notes, in a separate folder tied with twine gone brittle with age, were copies, painstakingly hand-copied because he could not have removed the originals, of correspondence between Silas Pruitt and the company's contractor discussing how to shore the shaft at minimum necessary cost, a phrase that made Clara's hands shake so badly she had to set the pages down. Her grandfather had kept proof, real and specific proof, that the collapse which had taken her father and ruined his own name had been not an act of God but a decision, made in an office to save money. He had tried to bring it forward once. She gathered from a later entry, and been discredited, his professional standing destroyed so thoroughly by Pruitt's influence that no paper in the territory would print his findings and no lawyer would take his case. So instead of shouting it into a silence that would not hear him, he had done the only thing a patient man knows how to do. He had kept the evidence safe and waited, though he could not have known for whom he was waiting, or that it would be his own granddaughter who would one day carry a lantern down those stairs. The second discovery came on her 3rd day in the chamber, when she noticed that one section of the rock wall, behind the farthest shelf, rang hollow under her knuckles exactly the way her grandfather had once taught her a false wall of stone would ring. Behind it, once she'd cleared the shelf and found the simple lever disguised as a support beam, was a narrower passage that led not deeper into the mountain, but along it, following, she would later understand, the very vein her grandfather had once been paid to survey, and had instead quietly claimed for himself when everyone else declared the ridge worthless. The passage opened into a small natural cavern where raw silver ore, streaked pale and unmistakable through the gray rock, glittered faintly in her lantern light, more of it than she had ever seen outside a mining company's assay office. There was a final ledger here, more recent than the others, its ink less faded, in which her grandfather had recorded the assay results he'd run himself, quietly, over years, using equipment he must have carried up piece by piece, so as never to arouse suspicion in town. His conclusion, dated only 2 years before his death, was that the vein was rich enough to sustain a modest, honest operation for a generation, and his final written words, which Clara read 3 times before she could trust her own eyes, said this: "I have told no one, for I have learned that men who will bury 4 bodies to save a season's wages will bury a 5th without a thought. I leave this to whoever comes looking with a patient eye, as I taught mine to be patient, in the hope they will use it not to punish, but to mend what punishment alone cannot." Clara sat a long time in that hollow mountain with the lantern guttering low, understanding at last that she had not inherited a worthless ridge at all, but a choice her grandfather had spent 15 years preparing for her to make. Word travels fast in a small mountain town, and it did not take long for Silas Pruitt to hear that the widow he'd turned out was spending her days up on Raven's Ridge instead of leaving the county as everyone had assumed she would. At first he dismissed it, telling anyone who asked that grief had addled her and she was welcome to freeze on that useless rock if she pleased. But when Clara began coming down into Solace Creek to speak quietly with Mr. Whitcomb about mineral rights and mining claims, and later to consult with an assayer from the county seat who confirmed, off the record and in hushed tones, that the samples she'd brought him were genuinely valuable, Pruitt's dismissal turned to alarm, and his alarm turned quickly to action. He sent men to the ridge first under the pretense of checking an old boundary line, though Clara, who had learned patience from a man who'd spent a lifetime practicing it, simply showed them her deed and asked them to leave the way they'd come. When that failed, Pruitt went to the land office himself and argued that the original Bishop claim had lapsed improperly and ought to be voided and resurveyed by the company, a request Whitcomb, to his credit, refused to process without a formal hearing. Pruitt then tried simple pressure, offering Clara an amount of money that would have seemed a fortune to her 3 months earlier, $300 for a ridge everyone in town still believed was worthless, an offer so far above the property's supposed value that its very generosity told Clara everything she needed to know about how badly he wanted it quietly gone. She refused him, of course, And in refusing, she made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county at the very moment she had the least protection against one. Pruitt began speaking openly in town of the bishop woman's instability, suggesting she'd inherited her grandfather's madness along with his rock pile, and several merchants, out of fear more than malice, grew suddenly reluctant to extend her credit for supplies. It was Mrs. Agatha Red, who ran the boarding house and had lost her own husband in the cross-cut collapse 14 years before, who took Clara in without asking for payment she couldn't yet give. And it was Nell Caro, another cross-cut widow whose son had grown up fatherless on account of the very shaft Thomas Bishop had warned about, who first believed Clara's careful, quiet account of what she'd found. Because Nell had spent 14 years certain in her own heart that the collapse had not been the accident everyone was told it was. Between the three of them, working in the evenings after Clara's long days on the ridge, a plan began to take shape, not for revenge, which none of them truly wanted, but for something Clara's grandfather's final ledger entry had called mending, a word she found she liked far better than punishment, though she understood by now that in Solace Creek the two were sometimes required to travel together for even a little while. The hearing Pruitt himself had unwittingly demanded became, in the end, the very stage on which Clara laid out what her grandfather had left buried in the mountain. It was held in the schoolhouse, the largest room in town, and word of the dispute over the Bishop claim had drawn nearly every family who'd once had a husband or son working the Solace Creek mines. Clara stood before them with her grandfather's ledgers stacked on the table, her hand steady though her heart was not, and she read aloud, plainly and without embellishment, the survey notes from a year before the cross-cut collapse, the copied correspondence about minimum necessary cost, and the dates that lined up so precisely with the deaths of 4 men that no one in that room, not even Pruitt's own hired lawyer, could meet her eyes by the time she finished. Pruitt tried, predictably, to call the documents forgeries or the ravings of a discredited old man, but Sheriff Hollis, who had quietly cross-checked the handwriting against surviving letters Thomas Bishop had once sent to the county surveyor's office years before, confirmed before the assembled town that the hand was unmistakably genuine and old enough that no widow's grief could have manufactured it after the fact. It was Nell Caro who stood then, her voice shaking but clear, and said that she had waited 14 years to hear someone say plainly what she had always known in her bones, and that she did not want Silas Pruitt's ruin, only the truth spoken where the whole town could finally hear it. That, more than any legal argument, was what turned the room, because grief given permission to speak plainly has a way of drawing more grief up out of hiding. And by the time the hearing ended, a dozen other families had quietly confirmed pieces of the same story, corners cut and warnings ignored, that they had swallowed for years out of fear of a man whose power had rested, all along, on nobody ever comparing their private doubts out loud. Silas Pruitt did not go to prison. For the law in a territory like that one moved slowly and imperfectly, and the collapse itself was too old and too tangled in old contracts for any court to easily untangle. But the hearing broke something that had held him upright for 14 years, which was the town's willing silence. And once that silence broke, his standing broke with it. His mining company's credit was called in by banks in the county seat once word of negligence reached them. His contracts with the railroad quietly lapsed, and within the year he had sold his remaining interests and left Solace Creek altogether. A departure so unremarked and unmourned that Clara, watching his wagon roll out of town from the boarding house porch, felt not triumph but a strange, tired sorrow. The particular sorrow of watching a thing finally end that should have ended so much sooner. As for the ridge and its vein, Clara did not sell her claim to any large company, though offers came quickly once the assay results became known. Instead, working with Whitcomb and a modest bank loan secured against the ore itself, she organized the Bishop Caro Mining Cooperative, named for her grandfather and for Nell, offering shares and honest wages to any cross-cut widow or family willing to work it. With her grandfather's original survey notes posted plainly in the new shaft's entrance, so that no timber would ever again be shored at minimum necessary cost, while a bishop had say over it. The first season's modest profits went not into Clara's own pocket, though she was no longer poor, but into a new schoolhouse roof, a proper doctor's office for the town, and a small stone marker at the cemetery bearing the names of the 4 men lost in the original collapse. Her father's name among them, finally carved in granite instead of left to rumor. So it was that Clara Doyle, the widow everyone in Solace Creek had once called foolish for spending her last $9 on a worthless ridge, became instead the woman who quietly rebuilt the town that had cast her out, not through vengeance, but through the same patient her grandfather had spent a lifetime teaching her to keep. She thought of him often in the months that followed, standing on the ridge at evening with the brass compass in her pocket, remembering a gray stone split open to show the quartz hidden inside it, and she understood at last what he had meant all those years ago on the overturned bucket by his lamplight. The world is quick to price a thing by what it shows on the surface, quick to call a person or a place worthless because grief or misfortune has left it looking plain and unpromising. But worth, real worth, is patient, and it waits, sometimes for 15 years in the dark, for someone willing to come looking with more than just their eyes. Clara Doyle had come to Raven's Ridge with nothing but $11 and a name she'd learned to keep quiet, and she left it, in the end, having restored not only herself, but the very community that had once decided she was worth nothing at all. Thank you for spending this time with Clara and her grandfather's mountain. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless from the outside may simply be waiting for a patient eye. We'd love to know, in the comments below, of a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off. Until next time, stay close.